You ever notice how addicts can feel someone's presence before they even see them? Or how many of them develop an almost animal-like intuition for detecting lies, hidden movements, intentions between the lines? I'm not talking about superpowers. That would be romanticizing the chaos. I'm talking about something raw. Forced survival sharpens senses that most of us let atrophy. When you live in a permanent state of alert, when every decision can mean safety or collapse, the brain reconstructs its priorities. It stops processing the world as a predictable place and starts scanning it as a field of dangerous possibilities. The problem is that these abilities, extreme sensitivity, rapid reading of environments, capacity to predict behaviors, usually show up mixed with paranoia, distrust, and a permanent sense of threat. So the question isn't whether addicts develop these perceptions. The question is, what happens when someone leaves addiction but keeps carrying this hypersensitive radar? And more importantly, can you use this without being destroyed by it? Maybe the answer lies in understanding that these abilities aren't residual defects. They're poorly calibrated tools. And calibration requires time, honesty, and acceptance that not everything that survived chaos serves peace. The brain doesn't care about fairness. It cares about survival. And when you're deep in addiction, survival stops being about eating or sleeping. It becomes about predicting the next hit, avoiding the next threat, reading the room before the room reads you. This isn't a conscious choice. It's your system reorganizing itself under pressure. The part of your brain that's supposed to help you plan and control impulses gets worn down. But here's what most people miss. While one part breaks down, another part goes into overdrive. Your threat detector becomes hyperactive. It starts seeing patterns everywhere. Some of those patterns are real, some are ghosts. You can't always tell the difference, but that doesn't mean the skill itself is worthless. Think about it like this. A regular person walks into a party and registers faces, music, general vibe. An addict walks into the same party and immediately catalogs exits. Who's watching who, tension in someone's shoulders, the micro pause before someone answers a question. They're not trying to do this. Their body is doing it for them. This is what happens when your brain gets rewired by necessity. You become a walking antenna. The problem is that this system was built for crisis, not for calm. So when the crisis ends, the system doesn't shut off. It keeps scanning. It keeps finding threats, even when there aren't any. Or maybe I'm simplifying this too much, because sometimes the threats are real and everyone else is just too comfortable to notice them. There's something deeper happening here, though. Something that goes beyond just brain chemistry. When someone lives in constant survival mode, they start accessing parts of themselves that most people keep locked away. We all have layers, right? There's the version of yourself you show the world, the mask you wear to be acceptable, to fit in. Then there's everything underneath that, the raw stuff you don't want to look at. Most people spend their whole lives avoiding that basement. Addicts don't get that luxury. The substance breaks down the walls between those layers. Suddenly, you're face to face with everything you've been hiding from yourself. The rage, the shame, the parts of you that don't match the story you tell about who you are. And here's where it gets interesting. That confrontation, as brutal as it is, creates a kind of access. When you've seen your own darkness up close, when you've lived in it, you start recognizing it in other people. Not because you're judging them, but because you know the signatures. You know what buried anger looks like in someone's jaw. You know what shame sounds like in the way someone laughs too quickly. You know what fear feels like because you've been drowning in it yourself. This isn't mystical. It's pattern recognition born from being intimate with the full range of human emotion, especially the parts we're taught to hide. Most people only deal with what they think they want, what they believe about themselves. But there's this whole other territory, the stuff underneath conscious thought, the impulses and fears and desires that actually drive most of our behavior. Addicts, whether they want to or not, become experts in that territory. They learn to read the gap between what someone says and what they're actually feeling. They learn to sense the unspoken tensions in a room, the collective anxieties nobody wants to name. This happens because their own internal boundaries got shattered. When you're that exposed, that raw, you become porous to other people's hidden emotional states. The danger, and this is crucial, is that this sensitivity has no filter. You're picking up everyone's emotional garbage along with the useful signals. You're absorbing atmospheres like a sponge with no skin. And because your threat system is already maxed out, you interpret most of what you're sensing as danger. Someone's sadness registers as hostility. Someone's distraction registers as rejection. You're not wrong that something is there. You're just wrong about what it means. Or maybe not always wrong. Maybe sometimes you're seeing something true that the other person hasn't admitted to themselves yet, and that creates its own problems because now you're reacting to something they claim isn't happening. This is where the body and the mind crash into each other. Your nervous system is screaming threat. Your psyche is flooded with feelings and intuitions that seem to come from nowhere. And you're trying to function in a world that expects you to operate from logic and control. No wonder so many addicts feel insane. They're receiving 10 times the information everyone else gets, but nobody taught them how to sort it, how to tell the difference between their own stuff and what's actually coming from outside. There's also this. Addiction forces you into contact with something bigger than your personal story. When you're using, you're not just escaping your individual pain. You're tapping into something older, something human. The need to transcend yourself, to escape the limits of your own head, that's not a personal failing. That's a drive that shows up in every culture through ritual, religion, art. Addiction is what happens when that drive gets twisted. But the drive itself isn't bad. Here's the thing nobody tells you about getting clean. The sensitivity doesn't go away. You think once you stop using, once your body detoxes, once your brain chemistry stabilizes, you'll go back to feeling normal. But normal isn't waiting on the other side. What's waiting is all that heightened perception you developed, except now it has nowhere to go. During active addiction, that hypersensitivity had a function. It helped you navigate chaos, anticipate danger, stay one step ahead of collapse. But in recovery, in regular life, that same system becomes a liability. You're walking around with exposed nerve endings in a world that feels like sandpaper. The first few months clean, everything is too much. Conversations are too loud, emotions are too bright. Other people's moods hit you like weather systems. You walk into a room and you can feel the argument that happened there an hour ago. You talk to someone and you know they're lying before they finish their sentence. And the worst part is, you can't turn it off. You can't unhear what you're hearing, unsee what you're seeing, unfeel what you're feeling. This is the open wound part. You're functionally psychic, but instead of it being a gift, it feels like a curse. Because what good is knowing everyone's hidden pain when you're barely managing your own? Let me get specific here because this is where people lose the plot. There's a difference between accurate perception and paranoid interpretation. And when you're early in recovery, that line is almost invisible. Say you're talking to your partner and you notice they look away for a split second when you mention your day. Your sensitive system picks that up immediately. Now, there are multiple possible explanations. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they're thinking about something else. Maybe they're processing what you said. Maybe they're uncomfortable because you touched on something real. All of those could be true. But your brain, which spent years in survival mode, defaults to the worst interpretation. They looked away because they don't care. Because they're hiding something, because you're too much, because they're planning to leave. This is the paranoia trap. You're not imagining the microsignal. The look away happened, but you're catastrophizing the meaning. And here's where it gets messy. Sometimes you're right. Sometimes that look away does mean something significant. Sometimes your intuition is picking up on a real disconnection, a real lie, a real problem. So you can't just dismiss your perceptions as anxiety, but you also can't trust them blindly. You're stuck in this exhausting middle ground where you have to constantly interrogate your own reactions. Is this real, or am I spiraling? Is this them, or is this me? And that interrogation, that constant self-doubt, it's its own kind of torture. There's a psychological concept about how we carry material that isn't fully ours. When you grow up in chaos, when you survive trauma, you internalize patterns and beliefs that don't originate with you. They come from your environment, from the people who raised you, from the situations you had to adapt to. And those patterns live in your body as reflexes. Someone raises their voice, and your chest tightens before you even process what they said. Someone walks away mid-conversation, and you feel abandoned before you remember that they just went to the bathroom. These aren't logical responses, they're body memories. They're your system replaying old trauma on a loop. The problem is that these internal patterns start to blend with external reality. You're sensing something real in the present moment, but you're interpreting it through the lens of past wounds. So when your friend cancels plans, your body responds as if you're being rejected by your mother all over again. When your boss gives you critical feedback, your nervous system reacts as if you're being screamed at by your father. The current situation triggers the historical wound, and suddenly you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. This is how sensitivity becomes paranoia. You're responding to layers of experience simultaneously, and you don't have the tools yet to separate them. And then there's the shadow stuff, the parts of yourself you haven't fully integrated. Every human has impulses, desires, fears that they don't want to admit to having. Most people shove those into a dark corner and pretend they're not there. But when you're hypersensitive, when your internal walls are thin, you not only see your own shadow, you start seeing everyone else's too. You pick up on the aggression someone is suppressing. You sense the resentment they won't acknowledge. You feel the attraction they're denying. And because you're picking this up unconsciously, you don't always know what to do with it. Sometimes you project. You accuse someone of feeling something that's actually your feeling. You see your own unexpressed anger in their neutral face. You interpret their silence as judgment because that's how you're judging yourself. Other times, you're actually reading them accurately, but they're not ready to admit what you're sensing. So they gaslight you. They tell you you're imagining things, you're too sensitive, you're crazy. And because you already doubt yourself, because your perception has been unreliable in the past, you start to believe them. You start to think maybe you're making it all up. Maybe you can't trust anything you feel. This is the knife edge that recovering addicts walk. On one side is denial, shutting down your sensitivity completely, numbing yourself to avoid the overwhelm. On the other side is hypervigilance, trusting every fear and suspicion, turning into someone who can't relax because they're always braced for betrayal. Both extremes are survival strategies. Both make sense given what you've been through. But neither one lets you actually live. Neither one gives you access to the useful part of your sensitivity without the destructive part. Or maybe, and I'm thinking out loud here, maybe the destructive part and the useful part aren't actually separate. Maybe they're the same capacity pointing in different directions. The same skill that lets you read a room can also make you paranoid in that room. The same intuition that warns you about genuine danger can also manufacture danger where none exists. It's not that you have a good skill and a bad skill. It's that you have one skill with no guidance system. You're driving a car with incredible. So you've got this radar, it works. Sometimes too well. The question isn't whether to keep it or throw it away, because you can't throw it away. It's part of your wiring now. The question is, how do you recalibrate something that was built in crisis to function in non-crisis? How do you take a system designed for war and teach it to operate in peacetime? Because that's what recovery is, right? It's supposed to be peacetime. But your body doesn't believe that yet. The first mistake people make is trying to logic their way out of this. They think if they just understand their trauma, if they can explain why they react the way they do, then the reactions will stop. That's not how it works. Understanding is important, sure, but it doesn't live in the same part of your brain as the threat response. You can intellectually know that you're safe while your nervous system is still convinced you're about to die. These are parallel tracks that don't communicate well with each other. So, you end up with this weird split where you're telling yourself everything is fine while your hands are shaking and your heart is pounding and you want to run. What you need isn't more understanding. What you need is a new relationship with the signals your body sends you. Right now, every signal feels like a fire alarm. Your intuition says something's wrong and you immediately treat it as gospel truth. But intuition isn't always right. Sometimes it's pattern matching from old data. Sometimes it's your body trying to protect you from something that already happened. The work isn't to ignore those signals. The work is to create space between the signal and your response to it. Let me give you a concrete example. You're at dinner with friends. Someone makes a comment that lands wrong. Your gut clenches. Your sensitivity picks up on something. Maybe tension, maybe judgment, maybe nothing. Old you would either shut down completely or lash out defensively. But what if you just noticed the clench? What if you thought, okay, my body is registering something here. Let me stay present and see what this actually is instead of reacting from my worst assumptions. That pause, that tiny gap between stimulus and response, that's where recalibration happens. This is harder than it sounds because your system is used to instant reaction. Hesitation in active addiction could get you hurt. Overthinking could cost you the high, the safety, the survival. So, your brain learned to cut corners. It learned to make snap judgments and act on them immediately. But in recovery, those snap judgments are often wrong. They're optimized for a reality that doesn't exist anymore. So you have to retrain yourself to slow down, to sit with uncertainty, to let information come in before you decide what it means. There's a psychological principle about how we integrate split-off parts of ourselves. When you've been in survival mode, you fragment. Parts of you get locked away because they weren't safe to express. Your gentleness, your vulnerability, your playfulness, all the soft parts had to hide so the hard parts could keep you alive. But those hidden parts don't disappear. They just go underground. And they start communicating through symptoms, through sudden emotions that don't make sense, through body sensations that seem to come from nowhere. What most people don't realize is that a lot of what they think is external intuition is actually internal communication. You walk into a room and feel dread, and you assume the room is dangerous. But maybe the dread is coming from a part of you, that this room reminds you of something. Some memory you haven't processed, some feeling you've been avoiding. You meet someone new and immediately distrust them, and you think your radar is warning you about them. But maybe they just remind you of someone who hurt you, and your system is conflating past and present. This doesn't mean your intuition is useless. It means it's more complicated than a simple yes or no. Your sensitivity is picking up on something real, but the interpretation needs work. And this is where the recalibration gets interesting, because you can't do it alone in your head. You need external reality to test against. You need to take risks, to trust people incrementally, to see if your predictions actually come true, or if you're just replaying old scripts. Say you sense that someone is angry with you. That's the signal. Old pattern says hide, defend, attack, run. New pattern says, let me check this. Let me ask them directly, are you upset with me? And here's what happens, they might say, no, I'm just tired. And you have to sit with that. You have to let their answer matter more than your feeling. Not because your feeling is worthless, but because you're trying to learn when your feeling is accurate and when it's not. Over time, with enough data points, you start to notice patterns. You start to recognize when your intuition is clean and when it's contaminated by past experience. But this process is terrifying because it means you can't trust yourself completely. And after everything you've been through, after all the times other people failed you, your own perception was the one thing you could rely on. Now, I'm telling you that you have to doubt even that? Yeah, kind of. Or not doubt exactly, but hold it lightly. Treat it as information, not as truth. Your intuition is one data point among many. It deserves attention, but it doesn't get to be the dictator. There's another layer to this that people avoid talking about. When you're hypersensitive, you're not just picking up on other people's hidden emotions. You're also broadcasting your own. You walk into a room anxious, and people feel that. They respond to your anxiety, which confirms your anxiety, which makes you more anxious. It's a feedback loop, so part of recalibration is learning to manage your own signal. If you're constantly radiating fear or suspicion or need, people will react to that, and then you'll interpret their reaction as proof that your initial feeling was correct. But you created the situation you were afraid of. This is where the concept of the personal unconscious comes in. All the stuff you're not aware you're carrying. You think you're being neutral, but you're actually showing up with an agenda. You think you're just observing, but you're actually influencing. And the people around you are doing the same thing. They've got their own unconscious material, their own projections, their own unprocessed garbage. So when you walk into a room, you're not reading a clean signal. You're reading a mix of their stuff and your stuff, and the collective stuff that humans just carry around. The only way through this is to get really honest about your own patterns. When do you tend to misread situations? What are your triggers? Where do you project? This requires a level of self-awareness that's brutal. You have to catch yourself in the act of distorting reality and admit it. You have to notice when you're making someone else responsible for your feelings. You have to own the ways you manipulate situations to confirm your fears. None of this is comfortable, but it's necessary if you want your intuition to actually serve you instead of sabotaging you. And here's the paradox. The more you question your intuition, the stronger it actually gets. When you stop treating every feeling as fact, when you start testing your perceptions against reality, you develop discernment. You learn the difference between clean intuition and muddy intuition. Clean intuition is calm, it's quiet, it doesn't need to convince you, it just knows. Muddy intuition is loud, it's frantic. It demands immediate action. It's usually fear, wearing an intuition costume. So, recalibration isn't about killing your sensitivity. It's about refining it. It's about teaching your system that not. Let's talk about the part that makes people uncomfortable. There's this narrative floating around recovery circles, spiritual communities, self-help spaces, that addiction is somehow a gift. That your suffering carved out a deeper capacity for empathy, for insight, for connection. That you're now more awake, more aware, more spiritually advanced than people who never had to claw their way out of hell. And look, I get why that story is appealing. It gives meaning to the pain. It turns your worst experience into your greatest teacher. It makes you special instead of broken. But it's also dangerous, because it romanticizes something that nearly killed you. It reframes survival skills as spiritual abilities, and that confusion keeps people stuck. You start to think that your hypervigilance is wisdom, that your inability to relax is enlightenment, that your terror-based intuition is a divine gift. And if you believe that, why would you ever work to change it? Why would you recalibrate your nervous system if being broken is actually being blessed? The truth is messier. Yes, you developed capacities that other people don't have. Yes, you can read situations and people in ways that seem almost supernatural. But that's not because you're spiritually evolved. It's because you had no choice. You adapted to an environment that required those skills, or you didn't make it. That's not transcendence. That's trauma. And conflating the two keeps you from actually healing. Here's what actually happens. You come out of addiction raw and sensitive and capable of perceiving things most people miss. That's real, but it's not a higher state of consciousness. It's a survival state. And if you treat it like enlightenment, you stay stuck in survival. You keep seeking chaos because chaos feels like home. You keep finding broken people to fix because that's where your skills are useful. You stay in the wound because you've convinced yourself the wound is sacred. Real spiritual growth, if we're going to use that language, isn't about staying hypersensitive. It's about integrating that sensitivity into a stable system. It's about learning when to turn the radar on and when to turn it off. It's about developing the capacity to be present without being overwhelmed, to care without absorbing, to see without taking on. That's not something addiction gave you. That's something you have to build in recovery. And maybe the hardest part is accepting that some of what you gained through addiction isn't actually useful. Some of it needs to be unlearned. The paranoia, the constant scanning for threat, the inability to trust, those aren't gifts. Those are scars, and scars can be honored without being worshipped. You can acknowledge what you survived without pretending it made you better. You can recognize the skills you developed without glorifying the circumstances that forced you to develop them. There's no enlightenment in addiction. There's only survival. And survival is brutal and desperate, and nothing about it is holy. What's holy, if anything, is the decision to stop surviving and start living. To take those hard-won perceptions and use them consciously instead of compulsively. To stop letting your past dictate your present just because your past made you good at reading danger. So, no, your addiction didn't give you spiritual abilities. It gave you trauma responses that happen to be socially useful sometimes. The work isn't to celebrate those responses. The work is to transform them into actual choices. To take what was done to you and make it something you do on purpose. That's where the real power is. Not in the wound, but in what you build after the wound stops bleeding. The thing is, we keep looking for redemption in the wreckage, like if we can just find the silver lining, then maybe it was all worth it. But some things aren't worth it, and that's okay. You don't have to make your suffering mean something cosmic to justify your existence now. You survived, you adapted, you developed capacities that most people will never need, and now you get to decide what to do with all of that. Maybe the real spiritual work isn't accessing hidden abilities or tapping into some deeper consciousness. Maybe it's just learning to be a regular person who can sit through dinner without scanning every exit, who can love someone without waiting for betrayal, who can feel safe enough to be boring. Because honestly, after everything, boring sounds like the actual miracle. Not the sensitivity, not the intuition, not the ability to see through people's masks, just the quiet, unremarkable piece of a nervous system that finally believes the war is over.